All right, so today we are starting by reviewing the muscles that we've discussed over the last two meetings. If you remember, we've seen first the muscles of the head, and first muscles that we've seen was my epicranius. I remember the epicranius did have an anterior belly. This was my frontalis muscle, and the posterior belly, this was my occipitalis muscle. And if you remember, we did have this sheet-like tendon connecting the two together. This was my gala aponeurotic. We've seen a circular muscle surrounding the eye. This is my orbicularis oculi, and the main action here will be to close the eye and allows you to blink. We've seen another circular muscle, this time around the oral orifice or the opening of the mouth. This is going to be my orbicularis oris. We've seen a muscle on the side of the cheek. This is my buccinator muscle or buccinator muscle. And the main action here of the muscle is to allow the compression of the food in the oral cavity, as well as it allows the suckling and whistling. A muscle that we've seen on here that gets its origin from the zygomatic arch and process and will be inserted in the angle of the mouth. So this is my zygomaticus. And if you remember, zygomaticus is what allows you to smile. We've seen a muscle here, a superficial flattened muscle that would be covering most of the neck structures. This was my platysma. And if you remember, the platysma is going to be responsible for the facial expression for horror and fright. We also did discuss an important muscle in the neck. This was getting its origin, as you see on here, from the sternum, from the clavicle, and it goes all the way to be inserted up in the mastoid process. If you remember, this was my sternocleidomastoid. And if you remember, the action of the muscle is going to be determined according to whether you're contracting one muscle at a time or you're contracting both sides in the same time. If I'm contracting each muscle by itself, this allows the head rotation from side to side. And if I'm contracting both sides in the same time, this allows me to pull my head down, allowing neck flexion. Another muscle that we've seen that also allows the movement of the neck, but this time was located in the back. Let me search right here. This was my trapezius, and if you remember, it gets its origin from the external occipital protuberance and external occipital crest, as well as from the spinous processes of the cervical and thoracic vertebrae to be inserted in the spine of the scapula, as what you see on here. If you remember, if I am fixing the origin, so my head is not moving, my spine is not moving, but I am pulling on the scapula. So if I'm contracting the upper muscle fibers, this allows the elevation of the scapula. If I'm contracting the middle muscle fibers, this allows scapular retraction. And if I'm contracting the lower muscle fibers, I am pulling on the spine to move backward like this. So this allows rotation of the scapula. So if I'm fixing again, if I'm fixing the origin and I'm pulling on the scapula for the scapula to move, I can perform elevation of the shoulder, retraction of the scapula, and rotation of the scapula. What if I decided to not move the scapula? So I'm fixing the scapula and I decided to pull on the head. So the head, the external occipital protuberance, is going to be pulled backwards towards my scapula. So this allows neck extension. So again, what is this muscle? This is my trapezium. And the trapezium, as you see on here, is going to be responsible to allow elevation of the shoulder, retraction of the scapula, rotation of the scapula, and neck extension. So if we're looking here at the relationship between the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid in terms of neck extension and flexion, you will see that both are performing opposing actions. They are antagonist muscles in terms of neck flexion and extension. One is performing flexion of the neck, the other one is performing extension of the neck. We've seen a group of muscles that would be allowing the movement of the arm. Seeing a large muscle on here, this is my pectoralis major. As you see, it gets its origin from the clavicle, from the sternum, and it will be inserted in the anterior aspect of my humerus. The pectoralis major was performing flexion of the shoulder, so I'm pulling the arm forward, and at the same time I will be allowing the adduction of the arm, so I'm putting the arm to move towards my body. We've seen another muscle on here that will be getting its origin from my clavicle, from the scapula, and it gets inserted all the way down to the lateral aspect of the shaft of the humerus. So when I contract this muscle, the deltoid muscle, gonna be pulling the arm away from my body. What we call this movement, if you remember, this was my abduction of the arm. So here, deltoid muscle, when it contracts, is going to be pulling this point to move towards this point. So as I am pulling the arm, I am moving the arm away from the body. This is an arm abduction or shoulder abduction. All right. We've seen another muscle, this time in the back. If you remember, this was my Latissimus dorsi. It gets its origin, as you see on here, from the spinous processes of the lower thoracic, from lumbar, from the sacrum, and it gets also its origin from the iliac bone. All those are going to be participating in creating the origin for the latissimus dorsi. All those muscle fibers that are going to be traveling up and forward towards my arm will be inserted in the anterior aspect of the arm. If you remember, this is where they will get inserted. If I remove the trapezius on here, if I remove the pectoralis major, I'm sorry. You'll see the latissimus dorsi is going to be inserted in the anterior aspect of the humerus. So when I contract the latissimus dorsi, what action would I be performing here on the arm? I will be pulling the arm to move backwards. And remember, what is the movements that we'll be performing if we're pulling the arm backwards. This is gonna be an arm flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. What movement is it? Can you remind me? So again, for those of you who are still confused about the movements on here, it's so critical to understand the movements. So let me draw on the other tablet on here. This is my arm, like this. The movement that takes place forward, backward, it's along the sagittal line. Where is the angle of the joint is so critical. All the joints will have their angle in the front except for my knee. So this is the angle of the joint on here. So when I'm saying here, what I'm saying here, that latissimus dorsi is going to be pulling the arm backwards like this. So what happened to the angle of the joint? I have a larger angle, I have a wider angle of the joint. So having a wider angle of the joint, this is my arm, it's pulled backward like this. Having a wider angle of the joint, this means if I'm moving along the sagittal plane, this means it's an extension. This is by definition. This is what we call an increase in the angle of the joint along the sagittal plane. This is by definition. How about adduction and abduction? Here, I'm not moving along the sagittal plane, I am moving along the frontal plane. In other words, I'm not moving forward and backwards, I'm moving to the sides. If I am moving the arm towards my body, remember, I am putting the arm towards the body, putting the arm towards the body, as if you're adding your arm to your body. This is adduction. What if you're moving the arm away from your body? This is abduction. Is this clear? So, can you answer my question now? Latissimus dorsi, if we're looking on here, it gets its origin from the back. It's gonna be pulling the arm, this point on the arm, backwards. My arm is gonna be pulled backward because the muscle travels forward to the front. So when it contracts, it's gonna be pulling the arm to move backwards. So moving the arm backwards, what did we call this again? Yeah, I need all of you to respond to this. This is critical. I am pulling the arm backwards. So this means the angle of the joint gonna be increased. Here is a movement along the sagittal plane. Sagittal, remember, This is the section that splits the body into right and left. Here, this is a long sagittal. So I'm pulling the arm backwards. This is an arm extension. So critical for you to know the movements for any of what we're discussing to make sense. All right. Let me give you another example on here. We'll test you on this. This time I'm looking at the forearm. Not the arm, I'm looking at the movements of the forearm. This is my forearm on here. And I'm allowing the movement to take place along the elbow joint, which is the joint between my humerus and my radius and ulna down in here, my arm and forearm. So where is the angle of the joint? 1 or 2? Which one? All the joints will have the angle in the front. So this is going to be, yes, as you're mentioning, this is the angle of my joint. So if I told you I have a muscle called the biceps brachii, it's going to be inserted, it travels in here. Let me draw this in orange. So I have a muscle in here. It's going to be inserted, as we've mentioned last time, if you remember, in part in the radius called the radial tuberosity. So when it contracts, it's going to be pulling my forearm like this, forward. And I have a muscle in the back called the triceps brachii. It's inserted in my ulna like this. It's going to be pulling the forearm backwards. So what is the action of my biceps, which is located in the front here? Is it flexion or extension of the elbow? What do you think? Look, where is the joint? Where is the joint? The elbow joint is in the front. So when you are pulling on the radius for you to move it, you're going to be moving the radius forward. This is my forearm like this. I am putting the radius to move forward. So this is going to be flexion of the elbow. Flexion of the elbow. Flexion of the elbow. How about the triceps brachii? My triceps here. It's going to be pulling the ulna to move backwards. So the forearm is going to be pulled backwards. So this is going to be flexion or extension. Extension of the forearm at the elbow joint. Extension of the forearm at the elbow. Anybody is confused here about this? All right, so let me just want to make sure that you've got this. I am looking at here. This is the thigh. This is the gluteal region. This is my knee. And this is my leg, like this. And this is my foot. Where is the angle of the hip joint? This is a groin, okay. This is a side view. Is the angle of the hip joint 1 or 2? One, great. So if I have a muscle called the gluteus maximus, it travels behind the hip joint. So when it pulls the thigh, it's going to be pulling the thigh. So if I'm inserted like this in the femur, so I would be pulling the thigh to move backwards like this. So if this was the angle of the joint, 1, now the angle is like this. So what happened to the angle of the joint? When I'm pulling the thigh backwards, increase, right? Did you notice that the angle of the joint did increase when you pull the thigh backwards? Thigh is pulled backwards like this. So it's going to be flexion or extension if you are increasing the angle. So extension. So knowing that the gluteus maximus is traveling behind the hip joint tells you that it performs extension of the hip. Just knowing this information that the gluteus maximus is traveling behind the hip joint, this will automatically means that it's going to be pulling the thigh backwards. And if it pulls the thigh backwards, it's called an extension of the hip joint. Let's say still in the thigh. This time we are studying a straight muscle in the thigh called the rectus femoris. Again, remind me please, where is the angle of the joint, of the hip joint? Is it forward or backward? Is this 1 or 2? Only 2 responded, 3, 4, 5. Still have many of you unresponsive. Yeah, 1. This is the angle of the joint. How about the knee joint? 1 or 2? 2, exactly. So, putting this into consideration, where is the rectus femoris is traveling? Is it traveling in front of the hip, in front of the knee, or behind the hip, behind the knee, or where exactly? What do you think? So my question here, is it passing in front of the hip joint, in front of the knee, in front of the hip, behind the knee, behind both of them, or in front both of them? What do you think? We are talking here about the rectus femoris. As you see on here, it's passing in front of the hip, in front of the knee. How would I know? This is something that you need to study. This is something that you need to memorize. You need to remember that this muscle is located in this part of the body, in the anterior aspect of the thigh. It travels in front of the hip, in front of the knee. All right, this is something that you need to study. This is something that you can't guess. And relying on this information, you will be able to know if I am passing in front of the hip joint. So when I shorten the length of the muscle, what's going to happen to the hip joint? It's going to be moving forwards or backwards. What do you think? If you're shortening the length of this muscle, you're going to be pulling the thigh to move like this, forwards. I am pulling the thigh to move forwards. So what's going to happen now to the angle of the joint, the new joint? Did I increase the angle of the joint or did I reduce the angle of the joint, of the hip joint? Here we're looking at the hip joint. Am I increasing the angle or reducing the angle of the joint? It's a reduction. I'm reducing the angle of the joint. And this movement is along the sagittal plane. So it's going to be what movement? If you're reducing the angle of the joint along the sagittal, it's going to be flexion of the hip joint. Exactly. If we're looking here at the same muscle, rectus femoris, where does it travel? In front or behind my knee joint? See on here, it travels in front of the knee joint. So if I did, this was the angle of my joint, like this. This was the angle of the joint. And now I contracted the rectus femoris. So now the angle of the joint will be increased or reduced. So look here, I'm pulling the leg to move forward. So what happens to the angle of the joint now? It's increased. And when you increase the angle of the joint along sagittal plane, this is what we call extension of what joint? Of the knee. So when you are looking at your list, the PDF file that has the list of muscles, movements, and attachments that you are required to know for this upcoming exam, don't just try to memorize every single word on it to not get confused. You need to make sense of the information. Look, where is the muscle located? Is it located in front, behind the joint? Where is the angle of the joint? So when I contract, when I reduce the length of the muscle, what movement would I allow? What's going to happen to the angle of the joint? Will it increase? Will it be reduced? According to what? According to where is the muscle located in relationship to the joint angle. So in some cases, when you increase the angle of the joint, along sagittal is called extension. You reduce the angle of the joint, along sagittal plane is going to be flexion, and so on. Any question? Any question on here? Anything which is disturbing for any of you here before we move on? All right, great. So back to our muscle review. So we've seen the latissimus dorsi. So again, back to the latissimus dorsi. what I did perform on here, I am performing an arm extension. I am putting the arm backward, and as a result, what's going to happen to the shoulder joint? The shoulder joint angle will be increased along my sagittal plane. It's an arm extension. Another group of muscles that we've seen last class, this was the muscles that will be getting their origin from the scapula and will be inserted in the humerus. We call those are the rotator cuff muscles. If you remember, we did see four of them which are required to know for the upcoming exam. We've seen one that gets its origin from the fossa above the spine of the scapula, so we call this as my supraspinatus. We've got one that gets its origin from below the spine of the scapula, so we call this as my infraspinatus. And if you see on here, we have two cylindrical shaped muscles. So we call them teres. One is smaller than the other, so this is much smaller than this one. So we call the smaller one, it's my teres minor, compared to the big one, it's my teres major. We didn't have to know the teres major for the test, but just for you to remember that the teres muscles that we have is the teres minor. It has a much smaller size compared to the teres major. Another rotator cuff muscle that we've seen last class was a muscle located on the anterior aspect of the scapula. You see on here, it's located between the scapula and the thoracic cage. But remember, the scapula is not erected, it's inclined forward. So in front of the scapula is also below the scapula. So we're gonna call this fossa where I will get the origin for this muscle is called my subscapular fossa. And the muscle itself is gonna be my subscapularis. So again, if you are looking here at the rotator cuff muscles, the main action of the rotator cuff muscles will be to stabilize the shoulder joint. Why it's so important to stabilize the shoulder joint? Because the glenoid cavity is so shallow, and it is at a much greater risk of getting dislocated compared to something like the hip joint. So again, what do we call those muscles? First one above the spine of the scapula, this is my supraspinatus. Below the spine of the scapula, infraspinatus. A cylindrical shaped small muscle is gonna be my teres minor. And on the other side, in the front of the scapula, between the scapula and the thoracic cage, we've got a muscle located below the scapula, so we're gonna call it my subscapularis. We've seen a group of muscles located in the arm that will apply their action to allow the movement of the forearm, and this includes my biceps brachii. Remember, the biceps brachii did have two heads, has two parts. A head that gets its origin from my coracoid process, and another head that gets its origin from just above my glenoid cavity. So the one that gets its origin from the coracoid process is going to be my short head, and the one that gets its origin from the glenoid cavity or above the glenoid cavity, this is going to be my long head of the biceps brachii. If you notice on here, the biceps tendon going to be inserted down in the radial tuberosity of the radius. Remember, the biceps is traveling in front of both the shoulder and the elbow joints. So I'm allowing flexion of both shoulder and elbow. Also being inserted in the radius, this allows you to rotate the radius partially around the ulna, allowing you to perform a pronation. So again, what are the actions of the biceps brachii? I'm the prime mover for elbow flexion. I'm helping with the flexion of the arm, and I'm allowing the pronation of the hand. Looking at the posterior aspect of the arm, we've seen a muscle formed of 3 heads. One that gets its origin from the scapula, as you see on here. This is going to be my long head of the triceps brachii. And we've got 2 heads. One is superficial, one is deeper to it. We call the superficial one, this is my lateral head of the triceps. And the deeper one is the medial head of the triceps. All the 3 heads going to be inserted down in the olecranon process of my ulna. Olecranon process of the ulna. So again, when I pull on the olecranon process, I pull it to move it backwards towards my origin. So what action am I performing? I would be performing extension of the forearm or extension of the elbow. We've seen 4 muscles, if you remember, located in the forearms that will be applying their action on the wrist joint and the fingers. We've seen a muscle located in the anterior aspect of the forearm, and if you remember, located in the anterior aspect of the forearm, so this is going to be a flexor muscle, so we're going to be calling it flexor. And remember, I have only an action on the wrist joint as I have a single tendon, as you see on here. So a muscle in the anterior aspect of the forearm that has a single tendon, this is going to be flexor carpi. I'm performing flexion of the wrist. And if you notice on here, the tendon of the biceps is going towards the thumb, so it's going laterally. So if it goes laterally, it's going to be on the same side as the radius. So we're going to call this muscle is my flexor carpi radialis. If you remember, flexor carpi radialis allows flexion of the wrist as well as abduction of the hand. I will be pulling the hand to move away from the body. This is the abduction of the hand. We've seen 3 muscles located in the posterior aspect of the forearm. Seen one of them that had 4 tendons going to the medial 4 fingers. This is going to be extensor digitorum. We've seen another one which is large, has a single tendon, and it's long. Its tendon is going towards the thumb as the previous one. It's going to be getting its origin from the back. It's going to be inserted in the back. So it's going to be an extensor. And as I have a single tendon, this tells me that I'm only applying an action on the wrist joint. I would be an extensor carpi. And if the tendon you see on here is directed towards the thumb, it's going to be on the same side as the radius. So we're going to call it extensor carpi radialis. But remember, we've had 2 muscles that did have the same exact characteristics, but one is longer than the other. So we're going to call the long one is my extensor carpi radialis longus. Can you remind me of how did we of the name of this muscle on here. First, am I located in the anterior or posterior aspect of the forearm? If you're looking on here, anterior or posterior aspect. So you remember olecranon process. It's gonna be on the posterior aspect. Posterior aspect. So being on the posterior aspect, when I pull on the wrist joint, would I be performing a flexion or an extension? When I pull on the posterior aspect of the wrist, it's going to be performing extension. So what do I call the muscle here? Extensor or flexor? And extensor. Extensor. Exactly. And do I have an effect only on the wrist joint or also on the fingers? How would I know? Do I have one tendon or four tendons going to the fingers? You see on here, you have only one tendon. See on here, this is the one that has four tendons. This is the extensor digitorum. But this one, that I'm pointing to, has a single tendon, one tendon, one tendon. So if I have one tendon, so I'm only affecting my wrist joint. So I'm not going to the fingers. So what would I call this extensor? It's extensor, and something related to the wrist joint is going to be carpi. So this is the extensor carpi. Am I going to the medial or the lateral aspect? Am I going to the lateral side or the medial side? How would I know? Look at the thumb. Are you going to the same side as the thumb or the opposite side to the thumb? You're going to the opposite side of the thumb. So thumb in an anatomical position, thumb is lateral. Here on the opposite side is going to be medial. So here, this muscle is going towards the medial side of, so it's going to be relate on which side, the radius or the ulna? If it's going towards the medial side, it's going toward it's going to be located on the same side as the ulna, and that's why we're going to call the muscle extensor carpi ulnaris. Is it just from the appearance? The appearance of the muscle reminds me of the name of the muscle, and it reminds me of the action of the muscle. I'm performing extension, I'm performing extension of the wrist, and I'm ulnaris. Ulnaris means on the medial side, and being on the medial side, this means I'm putting the hand to move inwards, towards my body. Boom, boom, boom. What do we call this movement? If you're moving towards the body, this is an adduction. You're moving towards the body, it's an adduction. Remember, like what we've mentioned last class, pull your little finger, your pinky, pull on your pinky. It's gonna be pulling the hand towards your body, pulling the hand towards your midline. So it's an adduction, exactly. We've seen few or most of the muscles of the abdominal wall. If you remember, we did have a muscle which fibers are traveling in an oblique angle, so we call it an oblique muscle. But when we removed it, we've seen another one which fibers are traveling in an oblique angle. So we decided to call the superficial one, it's my external oblique, and the deeper one is going to be my internal oblique. If you remember, I'm getting my origin from lower ribs, from the costal cartilage, from the lower part of the body of the sternum and the xiphoid process to be inserted down in the iliac bone, pubic bone, and the inguinal ligament. So if we're looking on here, what is the action of this muscle? I am pulling the pelvis towards my chest, and also I'm traveling in an oblique pattern. So I'm pulling it at an angle. So if this is the pelvis, I'm pulling it up in an angle, up in an angle, up angle, up angle, up angle. So this allows flexion and rotation of the spine. Allows flexion and rotation of the spine. Flexion and rotation of the spine. What did we see underneath? On the same level as the internal oblique muscle, we've seen straight muscle of the abdomen, rectus abdominis. Yes, Lakeisha. Yes, Lakeisha. Pinky, when you are on the same side as the pinky, it's going to be on the same side as the ulna. You are on the medial side. Thumb is going to be on the outside. It's going to be lateral. It tells you that this is the lateral side. It's going to be on the same side as the radius. Exactly. All right, so back to the rectus abdominis. Again, straight muscles in the abdomen, rectus abdominis. It gets its origin again from the thoracic cage. It gets inserted down in the pubic bone. So when I pull the pubic bone towards my chest, what action would I be performing? I'm performing flexion of the spine. And at the same time, I'm allowing some degree of rotation. But again, who performs most of the rotation of the spine is going to be my oblique. Who performs most of the flexion of the spine is going to be my rectus abdominis. Is this clear? Clear is the concept on here? All right, if you remember, what did we call this connective tissue that will be connecting my rectus, my two recti together? White line is what we've called linea alba, which means white line. Linea alba is the white line connecting the two recti. We've also discussed the muscles that will be allowing the movement of the thigh. And if you remember, we've seen two muscles in the back, gluteus maximus, and underneath it, located laterally, this is going to be my gluteus medius. Remember, gluteus maximus is going to be the prime mover for hip extension. Remember, it travels behind the hip joint, so when it contracts, it's going to be pulling the thigh backwards. I am pulling the thigh backwards. This is the thigh. When you contract this muscle, you're pulling the thigh backwards. And backward movement of the thigh means you are increasing the angle of the joint. Increasing the angle of the joint is what we call extension. So the prime mover for hip extension is going to be the gluteus maximus. If I remove the gluteus maximus in here, I will see another muscle located in the gluteal region. It's going to be getting its origin, if you see on here. I'm getting my origin from the iliac bone to be inserted down in the greater trochanter of my femur. Let me remove. So I'm getting my origin from the iliac bone to be inserted in the greater trochanter of the femur. So this allows you to do what movement? You're pulling the greater trochanter like this. So when you pull on it, you're gonna be moving the thigh out. I am moving the thigh away from the midline. This is gonna be abduction of the thigh at the hip joint. So remember, you're moving away from the midline, abduction, abduction. Another group of muscles that we've seen last time, this was group of muscles that we called the adductor muscle group. From the name, why do we call, what do we call the muscles of the adductor muscle group? So I got a question on here. Yeah, gap, exactly. So let me answer the question before we move on to the gap muscles. All right, so somebody is asking here, flexion means decrease and moving backwards. Not essentially moving backwards, but decrease the angle of the joint. For the hip, you see on here, if I'm moving the thigh backwards, it's an extension. But for the knee, if I'm moving the leg, if the leg here is moving backwards like this, it's not an extension. Why? Because the angle of the joint is here. So what happened to the angle of the joint? It has been reduced. So flexion means you are reducing the angle of the joint. You need to know where is the angle of the joint first. General rule, all the angle of the joints are going to be in the front. Exception here is going to be the knee and the foot as the ankle, as we're going to see. All right, so is this clear? Is this clear here? All right, so if I am reducing the angle of the joint, it's flexion. If I'm increasing the angle of the joint, it's an extension. But you need to first know where is the angle of the joint. All right, so let's move on to back to our adductor muscle group. Why did we call them adductor muscle group? Because the main actions that they will be performing is adduction. And again, can you remind me, please, what is adduction? Adduction means I am moving towards the midline. Adduction. I'm moving towards the midline. So you see on here, this group of muscles all are getting their origin from the pubic bone. And they will be inserted in the thigh, in the femur. Remember a mnemonic that we've used last class for us to remember the names of those muscles. Remember, between the two thighs, we've got a gap. G-A-A-P. So the first muscle here, this is going to be my gracilis muscle. And then I will see a smaller part of a large muscle. This is called my adductor magnus. And then I have another muscle on here, adductor longus. And finally, the fourth that we need to identify is going to be the pectineus. So again, we need to know only four muscles in the adductor muscle group: gracilis, adductor magnus, adductor longus. This is my third muscle on here, adductor longus, and this is going to be my pectineus. What's common between all those muscles is they share this almost the same exact actions. If we're looking on here, we'll remove this muscle. This is gracilis, adductor magnus, adductor longus, and pectineus. Gracilis, adductor magnus, adductor longus, pectineus. What did I notice on here? All of them are traveling in front of the hip joint. So they are aiding in what action? They are aiding in flexion or extension. If I am located in the front of the hip, if I'm located in the front of the hip joint, what action would I be performing? Flexion of hip. So I'm aiding in flexion. I am aiding in the flexion of the hip joint. What is the most prominent action? As you see on here, they are getting their origin from this point, from the pubic bone, and they get inserted in the femur. So what's gonna be the direct effect of them contracting? I am putting the femur towards my midline. So what action we call this? Moving the thigh towards the midline. It's an adduction. Adduction. Also, I'm helping with the rotational movement of the thigh. I am helping with the rotational movement of the thigh. But what is my main action here? It's gonna be to perform adduction of the thigh at the hip joint. Moving on to the muscles of the thigh that will be applying their action on the leg. In the anterior aspect of the thigh, we've seen 4 muscles. Those 4 muscles on here, those are gonna be forming together single tendon that's gonna be surrounding the patella. We call this is my quadriceps tendon. And as a continuation of the tendon, as it travels surrounding the patella, it is gonna be inserted in the tibial tuberosity. So we've got here quadriceps with its tendon surrounding the patella. The continuation of the tendon from the patella to the tibial tuberosity is what we call the patellar ligament. As you see on here, we've got a straight muscle of the thigh. This is the most superficial muscle of the 4. This is going to be my rectus femoris. And on the lateral side, we've got a large muscle, so we're going to call it vastus lateralis. On the medial side of the thigh, we've got medial muscle, a large medial muscle, so we're going to call it vastus medialis. And in between the vastus lateralis and the vastus medialis, we've got deeper to the rectus femoris, vastus intermedius. Remember, all the 4 muscles are going to be traveling in front of the knee, so they will be allowing extension of the knee. But only the rectus femoris is the one that's going to be traveling in front of the hip joint, aiding in the hip flexion. So again, all of them are performing what action? All of the 4 muscles of the quadriceps, all of the 4 together, they are aiding in or allowing what action? All the 4 muscles are sharing one action, which is, before you tell me flexion extension, tell me what joint? Flexion of what joint or extension of what joint? What do you think? Or the 4 muscles? You see on here is the vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and intermedius are those passing in front of the hip joint by any means or behind the hip joint by any means. What do you think? Let me what do you think? So again, am I related to the hip joint? Yes or no? Here, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius. Am I related to the hip joint? I get my origin from where? From the femur. And where do I get inserted? They all gonna be inserted down in the tibia. Am I related to the hip joint? Am I passing in front or behind on the other side of the hip joint? No. So would I have any action when I contract on the hip joint if I'm not traveling neither in front, behind, on the side of the hip joint? Would I have any action on the hip? So what is the common action of all the four muscles of the quadriceps femoris that they will be allowing? Knowing that the three vasti are not traveling in front or behind, or they are not related to the hip joint. So all of them are traveling in front of knee. All of the four will be exerting a force, and this force is conducted through my quadriceps tendon to reach the patellar ligament and will be pulling the tibial tuberosity. So all the four muscles of the quadriceps gonna share one action, which is knee extension. Only one action gonna be shared here by all the four muscles of the quadriceps femoris. All of the four gonna be allowing knee extension. The only one that's gonna be passing in front of the hip joint again is the rectus femoris, and this is the only one that helps with hip flexion. Did I say knee flexion? I'm passing in front of the knee, remember, passing in front of the knee, I'm increasing the angle of the joint. And if I increase the angle of the joint, it's gonna be an extension. All right, so again, all of the four muscles gonna be performing knee extension except for the rectus femoris, as it is the only one of the four traveling in front of the hip joint. Is gonna be aiding in the hip flexion. Is this clear? Is this clear? No, yes. No or yes. In between? It's not that okay? Yeah, yes, great. All right, we've seen a group of muscles in the back of the thigh. We call them the hamstring group. And if you remember, the hamstring muscles are four muscles, three of them on the posterior aspect of the thigh. One of them is gonna be traveling in front of the thigh, and then will finally reach the posterior aspect of the knee. Remember, what are the three muscles that you're gonna have in the posterior aspect of the thigh? One on the lateral side. How would I know that this is the lateral side on the test? If you get this diagram on the test, how would you know that this is the lateral side? Where is the sacrum? Sacrum is in the midline, at the midline on here. Sacrum is at the midline. So on the other side to the midline, if you are pointing to a muscle, this is going to be a muscle. On the lateral side of the posterior aspect of the thigh is going to be my biceps. See on here? Sacrum is in here. Sacrum is on here. All right, so what do we call the muscle on here? On the lateral side of the posterior aspect of the thigh, this is my biceps. But this time I'm traveling where? It's not in the arm, it's gonna be femoris. I am related to the thigh. So biceps femoris is gonna be the muscle on the posterior aspect of the thigh on the lateral side. On the medial side, I have two muscles. One is superficial with a long tendon. So we're gonna call it semitendinosus. Why semitendinosus? Semitendinosus, half of my length is a tendon. So semi half, tendinosus, tendon. So I have a long tendon. I am the superficial muscle on the medial aspect of the thigh, of the posterior aspect of the thigh, on the medial side of the posterior aspect of the thigh. Deeper to it, you can see part of it on here. It's a flattened muscle. This is going to be my semimembranosus. So let me remove all this on here. Look in here. This is going to be biceps femoris. It's on the lateral side of the posterior aspect of the thigh. On the medial aspect, you've got how many? Two. One is superficial. You see, it has a long tendon. One is deeper to it. It's flattened. It's like a membrane. So we're going to call the one with long tendon semitendinosus. We're going to call the one which is flattened like a membrane, we call it semimembranosus. So again, the three hamstring muscles that are going to be located in the posterior aspect of the thigh, those are my biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. If you notice on here, all of them will get their origin from the hip on here. So let me remove here. What part of the hip bone is this? Can you remind me? That they get their origin from. Can you imagine what we're looking at in here? Remember the part that we're sitting on? This is the pubis in the front. The part that we're sitting on right now, it's going to be the ischium, right? See, so biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, what joints are those related to? What joints am I related to as biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus? Hip and knee, right? Anybody's confused here? They are passing behind the hip and behind the knee. So if I'm passing behind the hip again, if I'm passing behind the hip joint, what action would I be allowing? If I'm looking here back at the previous drawings that we've had for the gluteus maximus, it was traveling behind the hip joint. So what action would I be performing traveling behind the hip joint when I contract? I am putting the thigh backwards, and this is gonna do what to the angle of the joint? Will be increased. So what action would I be performing here when I pull the hip, the thigh backwards? It's gonna be increasing the angle of the joint. This is what we've called hip extension. I hope this is clear. I hope this is clear. What if I'm traveling behind the knee? What action would I be performing on the knee joint? If I'm traveling here behind the knee, I am pulling on the leg to move it like this. So this is after I move. So what happened to the angle of the joint? This is after I contract. This is before I contract. So after I contract, what happened to the angle of the joint? It has been reduced. So all this was the angle before I contract, all this. Now when I contract the muscle, it's gonna be pulling the leg backwards. And as I pull the leg backward, now this is the angle of the joint. Remember, the knee joint is located on the posterior side. So it's gonna be a reduction in the angle of the joint. See, backward movement doesn't have to mean extension all the time. For the knee joint, is gonna be a flexion of the knee. All right, all right. Questions, questions? Another muscles that we've seen at the end of class last time, this was the longest muscle in your body. This was the Sartorius. And if you remember, Sartorius was traveling in front of both, in front of the hip and behind the knee, passing in front of the hip joint. What action would I have? In front of hip, what action would I have? Flexion of the hip. Passing behind the knee, what action would I have on the knee joint? Also flexion. And this is gonna be the only muscle that performs flexion of both hip and knee. So if you were traveling in front of both of them, you're gonna be performing flexion of hip, extension of knee. If you're traveling behind both of them, you're gonna be performing extension of hip, flexion of knee. But here, what makes the Sartorius slightly confusing for some is that it's gonna be traveling in front of one joint, but behind the other joint. So it's gonna be allowing flexion of the hip, but in the same time, flexion of the knee. What else would I be allowing? You see on here, I would be pulling this point to move towards this point of origin. So I'm allowing lateral rotation of the thigh. I am putting this point of the thigh to move towards this point where I get the origin from. So I'm putting the thigh to move from a medial position to a lateral position. It's a lateral rotation of the thigh. So again, what's gonna be the action here? The actions of my Sartorius. Sartorius muscle allows flexion of both hip, knee, and lateral rotation of the thighs. That's why we call it the carpenter's muscle. You see on here, this is a person sitting like this. He's performing, right? This is a thigh, knee like this. This is, all right, so let me draw this again. This is the thigh like this. This is the knee. So here, This is the action. I'm drawing here the action of the sartorius. It performs flexion of the thigh. I have a reduction of the angle of the thigh. And flexion of the knee. And I did pull the thigh out. Lateral rotation of the thigh. So I'm flexing hip, flexing knee, and performing lateral rotation of the thigh all at the same time, as if you're crossing your legs. All right, is this clear? All right, so this completes our review. Again, I did spend a lot of time in the review because this is going to be the last time that we're going to be discussing the muscles before your exam. Exam is not yet determined for the muscles. I'm still waiting to have a meeting with the college tomorrow, and I will let you be updated with the latest news, whether they will be sponsoring this virtual proctoring or not. So I'm waiting until I attend the meeting tomorrow with the college representatives. Did we already cover the lower leg? Not yet. The leg, we didn't cover the leg yet. All right, we did just cover the muscles that we did complete last time. All right, so let's have a break for 10. I want you to get refreshed a little, drink something, and we're gonna be back to complete the 4 muscles that are still remaining for us. And we're gonna start also our discussion of the muscular systems, the physiology of the muscular system. All right, so any questions before we go to the break? Any questions? All right, great. So let me put the timer on here for 10 minutes, and we're gonna be back in 10. All right, we'll see you in 10. All right, well, welcome back. We are looking back at the muscles of the lower limb. We are now starting the muscles of the legs that will be allowing the movement of the ankle joint and the toes. First, in the anterior aspect of the leg, you're going to have two muscles that we need to know. One has four tendons going to the lateral foretoes. Try to imagine here your leg as if your foot as if you are standing on your hands, like this. So this is the flexor or the extensor side of your wrist joint. What do you think? So looking at my hand down here, in an anatomical position, my hand is supposed to be like this. So this is the anterior side of my hand, of my wrist joint. So is this flexor or an extensor side? It's my flexor side, right? This is flexion. How about the back here? It's an extensor side. So this is a flexion of my wrist joint. This is the extension of my wrist joint. Flexion of the wrist, extension of the wrist. Flexion, extension. So try to apply this on your foot as if your foot is your hand, but your foot is the flexor side is going to be down or up. What do you think? If this is my foot, so this is going to be corresponding to my foot. So this side is my flexor side. This side is my extensor side. This is my flexor. This is my extensors. So if I am located in the anterior aspect of my leg, if I am located in the anterior aspect of the leg, if I pull on the foot like this, I will be called an extensor or a flexor. Here, I am putting on the foot like this. Is this extension or flexion? This is extension, but we don't call it extension. We don't call it extension, we call it dorsiflexion. If you remember in the foot, we don't call the movement here of the foot flexion and extension, we call it an upward movement of the foot is what we call dorsiflexion, and the downward movement of the foot is what we call the plantar flexion. But dorsiflexion is corresponding to what movement? It's corresponding to extension. But we don't call it extension. It is an extension, but we don't call it extension. So a muscle here in the anterior aspect of the leg, when it pulls on the foot is going to be moving up. So what do we call this movement? Dorsiflexion. And this is what corresponding to what movement of the hand? It's corresponding to extension of the wrist joint. So this muscle, is it going to be a flexor or an extensor? Putting this into consideration. It's going to be considered an extensor. So question here, dorsiflexion wouldn't pointing your toes the angle of the joint. What is the angle of the joint here? Where is the angle of the joint? It's corresponding as if you are standing on your hands like this. So the angle of the joint is located posteriorly, like as if I'm dealing with the knee. This is the angle of the joint. So when I have a plantar flexion, this is going to be my foot like this. So what happens to the angle? Now it has been reduced. So when you reduce the angle of the joint, it's going to be a flexion. But we don't call it flexion, we call it plantar flexion. What if I am pulling the foot upwards? Like this. So what happens to the angle of the joint? All this becomes the angle of the joint. So what happens to the angle? It has increased. And when you increase the angle of the joint, it's going to be considered an extension. But again, we don't call it extension. We call it dorsiflexion. Is this clear here? So again, let me draw this again. One more time. This is my leg like this. This is going to be my foot. Where is the angle of the ankle? Ankle has its angle posterior, like the knee joint. So if I am pulling the foot to move down, I'm located here, this is the muscle, is going to be pulling the foot downward. So we call this movement, it's called plantar flexion. It's corresponding to what movement? It's corresponding to, you see, I have a reduction in the angle of the joint. The angle of the joint has decreased. So we're going to call this movement, it's plantar flexion, but it's corresponding to the actual flexion. How about if I'm located here in the anterior aspect of the leg? So when I pull the foot, the foot is going to be moving upwards like this. So moving the foot upwards is what we call dorsiflexion. It's corresponding to what movement? Corresponding to, you see on here, what happened to the angle of the joint when you are moving the foot upwards? It's going to be increased. And when you increase the angle of the joint, it's going to be considered an extension. But we don't call it extension, we call it dorsiflexion. It's an extension movement, but we call it dorsiflexion. Is this concept clear? So having a muscle on here, will it be an extensor or a flexor? What do you think? In the anterior aspect of the leg, it's going to be an extensor. So if I have an extensor with 4 tendons going towards the lateral 4 toes, as you see on here, what movement is this muscle allowing? It's going to be allowing you to move your lateral toes up. So it's allowing dorsiflexion of the lateral 4 toes. Dorsiflexion of the lateral 4 toes. It's also passing in front of the ankle, so it helps with the dorsiflexion of the ankle joint. Do we call this a flexor or an extensor? It's an extensor muscle. Is it gonna be only applying its action on the ankle, or it goes to the toes as well? Toes are like the fingers, so we call this is a digitorum. I'm going to the toes or the fingers, I'm called digitorum. But we did see, if you remember, in the forearm, we've got an extensor digitorum. So how would I differentiate this one from the other one? This one in the leg is much longer, so we're gonna call it extensor digitorum longus. So again, what muscle are we looking at right now? We're looking at a muscle located in the anterior aspect of the leg. And now you understand, located in the anterior aspect of the leg, what action would I be performing? I'm performing dorsiflexion, which corresponds to what movement? It corresponds to the extension. So I will call this muscle my extensor. And am I only applying my movement on the ankle joint? No, I'm applying the movement also on the lateral foretoes. So I'm pulling the lateral foretoes up and helping with the dorsiflexion also of the ankle joint. So what do we call this muscle on here? It's going to be my extensor digitorum. It seems that I removed it. Extensor digitorum. How would I differentiate this one from the one in the forearm? I will call the one in the leg, as it is longer. We're going to call it extensor digitorum longus. How about this one? I'm located in the anterior aspect of the leg. And can you remind me, what is the large bone? What do we call the large bone of the leg? What do we call the large bone of the leg that will be holding all the body weight down from the femur towards my tarsal bones? Large bone of the leg. I have four answers. Four answers. 4 people did respond out of 26. 5, 6, still have 20. The largest bone of the leg is my tibia. Exact. Tibia. So we're going to call this muscle related to the tibia or related to the leg tibialis. And as I'm located on the anterior aspect of the leg, we're going to call this as my tibialis anterior. How would I differentiate tibialis anterior from the extensor digitorum longus? One has a single tendon, much larger. One has 4 tendons and much smaller in size. So again, 2 muscles that we need to remember here in the anterior aspect of the leg. One has a single tendon. This is my tibialis anterior. One that has 4 tendons going to the lateral foretoes. This is my extensor digitorum longus. All right, so what's going to be the main action, do you think, of the tibialis anterior? Tibialis anterior is going to be pulling the foot upward. And upward movement of the foot is what we call, again, dorsiflexion. I'm allowing the dorsiflexion of the ankle. So some things that gets a lot of you confused when we are mentioning the action, we either gonna describe the part of the body that moves or the joint that moves. So for example, dorsiflexion, we can say dorsiflexion of the foot, or it's the same thing as the dorsiflexion of the ankle, the same. Flexion of the hip or flexion of the thigh, it's the same. Right? This, I don't want to have this getting you confused. So we either mention the move, the action describing the part that moves, or we mention it as a description of the joint that allows this movement to take place. Looking here at the posterior aspect of the leg, we're going to have a large muscle. This is my gastrocnemius, and if you see on here, the gastrocnemius is traveling behind both the hip, both the knee joint and the ankle joint. Gastrocnemius, you see it travels behind the knee as well as behind the ankle joint. So what action am I helping with? Traveling behind the knee. What do you think? If you're traveling behind the knee joint, what action would you be allowing? You're traveling behind the knee joint. Traveling behind the knee joint, you're helping with flexion of the knee. Exactly. And traveling here behind the ankle joint, you're pulling on the calcaneus. So you are located in here in the posterior aspect, and you're pulling on the calcaneus. So when you pull on the calcaneus, what's going to be the movements that you're going to be allowing the foot to perform? It's going to be plantar flexion. So traveling behind the knee, I'm allowing flexion of the knee. Traveling behind the ankle, I'm allowing plantar flexion of the foot or the ankle. Questions? If you notice on here, gastrocnemius gets inserted in my calcaneus by a famous tendon. This is the Achilles tendon or the calcaneal tendon. The calcaneal tendon also going to be serving as the tendon of a deeper muscle, a muscle located deeper to my gastrocnemius. This is called the soleus muscle, soleus. If you notice on here, the soleus doesn't get its origin from the femur like the gastrocnemius, so it's not going to be passing behind the knee joint. It's only going to be exerting its force to allow the plantar flexion of the foot. So again, two muscles here that we're looking at in the posterior aspect of the leg that will allow the movement of the foot. We've got the gastrocnemius, we've got the soleus. Both of them gonna be inserted by a single tendon in my calcaneus. And when I pull on the calcaneus, I pull on the calcaneus like this. So what's gonna happen to the foot? The foot is gonna be moving down. Try to imagine here, this is my marker, I'm not sure here. Here. So if I'm putting this bottle up like this, so the rest of the bottle is going to be moving down. So when I put on this point upward, the foot itself moves down. So is plantar flexion raising the leg? Plantar flexion, yeah. So if you're talking here about the contraction of the calf muscles, the gastrocnemius and soleus, you can perform plantar flexion to raise up your body. So what you're, I'm not exactly sure what you are describing here, but let me draw this for you. So if this is a thigh like this is my leg and foot on here. So when I perform plantar flexion, the whole body gonna be raised up like this if you're standing on your toes. If this is a ground like this is a ground like this. So you're gonna be raising your whole body upwards. All right, questions? Again, the muscles lab exam is not determined yet. I am waiting for the meeting tomorrow with the college representatives, and I would let you, I will be updating you with the latest news. Please make sure you are checking your announcements on daily basis. So please make sure you're checking your Canvas announcements on daily basis. So each day, every day, you need to check your announcements. If something is going on, you won't be updated unless you're checking your announcements. Any questions? Any questions? All right, so today we are starting our discussion of the muscular system physiology. How's the muscle going to be contracting? What are the homeostatic imbalances that will be affecting the muscular system? We're going to be also discussing later in this chapter what's going to be determining the force, velocity, and the duration of a muscle contraction. We're going to have a brief hint about the difference between the skeletal muscle contraction, which is going to be our main topic in this chapter, and the smooth muscle contraction. This chapter is a fundamental knowledge for you to be able to understand the cardiac system. Very, very, very important. This chapter is highly important for you to understand later on when you are studying the cardiac system. You won't be able to understand the cardiac system without having this foundational knowledge that you're going to learn in the skeletal muscle. All right, so a quick overview. What are the different types of muscle tissue? If you remember, we did have three main types of muscle tissue. We got skeletal muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and cardiac muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue was located in your skeletal muscles, which are either attached to bones or attached to skin. Like what muscles are attached to skin, for example, that we've seen, like the platysma, the muscles of the facial expression. All right, so those are not essentially all the skeletal muscles going to be attached to bones to allow locomotion, to allow the movement. Some of them going to be attached to skin, especially those of the facial expression. If you remember, when we looked at the skeletal muscle tissue under the microscope, we've seen that the the skeletal muscle fibers were cylindrical, were striated, and they were multi-nucleated, means they do have more than one nucleus inside each of the muscle cells. So again, how the skeletal muscles did look under the microscope, we did have those cylindrical shaped muscle fibers or cells, which are striated and multi-nucleated. We've seen another type of muscle tissues. This was the cardiac muscle tissue. And if you remember, cardiac muscle tissue was present in the wall of the cardiac chambers of the heart. If you remember, when we looked at the cardiac muscle tissue under the microscope, the muscle fibers were still cylindrical in shape. They were still striated, but the key difference on here is that the muscle cells were branching. Muscle cells of the cardiac muscle tissue were branching. I have branches coming out of the cardiac muscle cells. Also, a very important characteristic that was only present in the cardiac muscle tissue is the presence of those dark lines between the cardiac muscle cells, and those dark lines are what we've called the intercalated discs. Those intercalated discs, those were formed by the gap junctions between the cardiac muscle cells. And if you remember, the gap junctions between the cardiac muscle cells are formed of channels, protein channels, that will allow free movement of the ions between the cardiac muscle cells for all the cardiac muscle cells to receive the electrical signal all in the same time for them to contract as one unit. So if you have thousands and thousands of cardiac muscle cells within the wall of your ventricles, you need all of them to contract in the same time for the heart to perform enough force to eject the blood out. So again, what allowed the signal to travel freely between the cardiac muscle cells is the presence of gap junctions that you can see here under the microscope at this low magnification power as dark lines between the cardiac muscle cells, which we're going to call the intercalated discs. We've seen the third type of muscle tissue. This was the smooth muscle tissue. And if you remember, smooth muscle tissue was present in the wall of hollow organs, all hollow organs except for the heart, which did have cardiac muscle tissue in its wall. Remember, the smooth muscle cells were spindle-shaped cells. They were mononucleated. Each cell has a single nucleus, and they didn't have any striations like what we've seen in the cardiac muscle or the skeletal muscles. So I am not striated. I have a single nucleus per cell, and the cell is going to be spindle-shaped cells. What are briefly the functions of the muscle? Muscle is going to be attached to the bones, and as they are attached to the bones, they will allow locomotion. You're allowing the body movement. Also, you're going to need muscle to contract in order to allow the fluid to move. Like what fluid to move? Like the blood, for example. If my heart is not contracting, I am not able to pump the blood to reach my organs. So here, if I don't have muscular contraction, the blood won't be flowing into my vessels. Also, it's going to be allowing you to maintain your posture and body position. So right now, when you're sitting right now, you are contracting your back muscles just to maintain your posture, not essentially to move, but just to maintain your body position. Stabilization of the joints, try to imagine that you're standing here and all of your leg and thigh muscles are relaxed. Would you be able to stand up? If all the muscles of your leg are relaxed, would you be able to stand up? No. Why? Because there is nothing to stabilize the knee joint. I need both sides to be contracted to keep the joint from moving towards one side. All right, so in order for me to stabilize the joint, I need to have muscles which are contracted. Also, remember, if it's too cold, in order for you to generate heat, your body gonna be contracting its skeletal muscles, because as we're gonna learn, a large portion of the energy consumed by the skeletal muscles is gonna be transformed into heat. Skeletal muscle, as we mentioned earlier, they are formed of cylindrical shaped muscle cells. We call the muscle cells muscle fibers. So if you see fibers, muscle fibers, this means muscle cells. A muscle fiber is the same as muscle cell. Those muscle fibers are going to be striated. They are, if you remember, under voluntary control. So you have conscious control of your skeletal muscles, and they are powerful compared to other muscles. If we're looking here at the skeletal muscle from inside, you see on here, each one of those is a muscle fiber. This is a single cell. This is one cell. This is another cell, another cell, another cell, another cell. Each one of those is going to be, I'm sorry, this is a filament. I'm sorry, this is not a cell. This is a filament. Filament, filament, filament. Those are the contractile filaments that we're going to discuss in a minute. Inside each of them, you have a bunch of filaments. And all together here, this is one cell. This is what we call a muscle fiber. So again, what we're looking at in here is one muscle fiber. A bundle of muscle fibers gonna be attached to one another by connective tissue. We call this is my endomysium. And the endomysium is gonna be the areolar connective tissue surrounding each of the muscle fibers. So you see on here, each muscle fiber is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue. I will be drawing this in blue. This layer of connective tissue is my endomysium. Endo on the inside. A bundle of muscle fibers, a bundle of cells is going to be surrounded by perimysium, another layer of connective tissue not surrounding single cells. It's going to be surrounding bundles of cells all together, covering the whole muscle from outside. This is my epimysium. Epi on top. So surrounding each muscle cell, each muscle fiber, this is inside endomysium. surrounding a bundle of muscle cells. This is my perimysium. Surrounding the whole muscle is going to be my epimysium. So how the muscles going to be attached to the bone? They have either a direct attachment or an indirect attachment. Direct attachment is the fusion of the epimysium of the muscle, which is the outer connective tissue layer that will be covering the whole muscle from outside. So you have the muscle on the inside like this. It's going to be surrounded by epimysium. And if this is my bone here, if you remember, the bone is surrounded by a connective tissue membrane. This is called my periosteum. The fusion between the epimysium and the periosteum of the bone, this is what we consider a direct muscle attachment. I have an indirect muscle attachment in which I have all the connective tissue wrappings of the muscle fibers will be forming together a tendon. So all the connective tissue that we have in here will be wrapped and will form a cord-like structure. And the cord-like structure on here that will allow the muscle to be attached to the bone, it's going to be a tendon. If those connective tissue wrappings are not forming a cord-like structure, they are forming a sheet-like structure, this is called an aponeurosis. Can you remind me of an aponeurosis that we've seen? A flattened tendon that we've seen. Chest muscle. Aponeurotica, yes. What did we call it? The gala aponeurotica. Remember, gala aponeurotica was the sheet-like tendon connecting the frontalis muscle to the occipitalis muscle. Remember on here? Of the epicranius. The epicranius was formed of two muscles. An anterior one was my frontalis, and the posterior one is the occipitalis, and we've got this sheet-like tendon. This is my gala aponeurotica. Exactly. So an aponeurosis is simply a sheet-like tendon. Looking here at long cylindrical cells, those are what we call the muscle fibers. Again, each one of them has more than one nucleus. I am multi-nucleated. They have a lot of mitochondria. And as the muscle cells are going to be in need to produce a lot of energy, and if you remember, the energy form that the muscle consumes or the cells consume is going to be my ATP. In order for me to produce ATP, I need to have a nutrient, which is like the glucose. I need to have oxygen to burn this glucose. And I need to have a place where I can burn this oxygen and the place where I can burn this glucose in the presence of the oxygen. And this place is going to be my mitochondria. So you need three things on here for you to be able to produce the energy needed for the muscle to contract. You need glucose, you need oxygen, and you need the organelle responsible for the energy production in your cells. This is the mitochondria. Glycosomes, those are stored form of the glucose in the form of glycogen. This is how I keep the glycogen, which is the storage form of the glucose, inside the muscle cells. I have inside the muscle cells also a pigment, which is my myoglobin, which is very similar to the hemoglobin located in the red blood cells. And the main function here of the myoglobin would be to store oxygen. So you see here, I've got the glucose, I've got stores of glucose, I've got stores of oxygen attached to the myoglobin, and I've got the mitochondria is the organelle responsible to produce the ATP and the energy needed for the muscle to contract. Important terms that we need to mention at this point before we discuss our main topic today. This is going to be sarcolemma. What do I mean by sarcolemma? This is the plasma membrane of my skeletal muscle cell. Plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle cell. Sarcoplasma is going to be the cytoplasm of the skeletal muscle cell. The myofibrils, those are the contractile elements located within the skeletal muscle cells. So again, sarcolemma, it's the plasma membrane. Sarcoplasma is going to be the cytoplasm, and the myofibrils, those are the contractile elements of the skeletal muscles, which will allow you to contract. All right, so what is muscle contraction? What do you think? The easiest way to look at muscle contraction. We're always saying the muscle contracts, and as it contracts, it's going to be pulling on the insertion, it's going to be pulling the organ. What is muscle contraction? Muscle contraction, shortening of the length of the muscle. All right, so here we're discussing one of the most complicated topics this semester. All right, so please pay attention here with me. If I'm looking here at one muscle fiber, again, what's a muscle fiber? It is a muscle cell. Each muscle fiber, as we've mentioned, has striations, dark lines, lying adjacent to one another. We're going to be dividing the muscle fiber into contractile units. Each one of those units is going to be called my sarcomere. So again, what is the sarcomere? Sarcomere is simply this distance, which will have only one striation. This distance on here is another sarcomere, has one striation in it. This distance here has one striation. What is the sarcomere by definition? It is the contractile unit of the skeletal muscle cell. So what is the internal structure of this sarcomere? The sarcomere, each sarcomere is going to be formed of alternating thick and thin filaments. So thick filament, thick filament, thick filament, thick filament. Alternating with those thick filaments, we're going to have thin filaments, like this. So again, what is the basic structure of my sarcomere? It is formed of thick filaments alternating with thin filaments. The thick filaments are going to be attached in the middle all together by protein filaments. We call this is my M line. All the thin filaments at the periphery here are going to be attached together by what we call the disc. So again, what is the structure of a sarcomere? The sarcomere is formed of alternating thick filaments and thin filaments. Thick filaments are attached at the center of my sarcomere by the M line, compared to the thin filaments are going to be attached to one another by the Z discs. By definition, what is the sarcomere? This is the distance between two successive Z discs. The distance between two successive Z discs is what we call the sarcomere. So where is the sarcomere on here? On this diagram, see this portion on here. This pink line is simply all those thick filaments together. All this will appear under the microscope as one striation. All those thick filaments on top of one another, those will appear as one striation under the microscope. And this empty space, actually it's not empty, it has here, I have thin filaments running on both sides of the striation. So what we're looking at in here again, we're looking at a striation, which is simply a set of thick filaments running on top of one another. And on both sides of the striation, we've got the thin filaments which are running on top of one another. All right. All what we're looking at in here is this distance. So in a muscle fiber, a muscle cell is formed of many sarcomeres that are running adjacent to one another. So what we are going to be talking about in here gonna be taking place in every single one of the sarcomeres in my skeletal muscle cells. All right, any problems so far? Any problems so far? So again, what is the sarcomere? Sarcomere is the contractile unit of the skeletal muscle cell. It's going to be formed of thick filaments alternating with thin filaments. Thick filaments altogether will appear as this one striation. And on both sides, we don't have those thick filaments. We have only thin filaments running. So this going to be lighter in color under the microscope. Remember, thick filaments are attached to one another at the center by the M line. The thin filaments are attached to one another by the Z discs. The thick filaments are formed of protein subunits called the myosin, compared to the thin filaments are formed by protein subunits called the actin. Actin is the main type of protein subunits that is forming my thin filaments of the skeletal muscles. We're going to see two other types as we keep going. So again, thick filaments or the myosin filaments, and the thin filaments or the actin filaments. Attaching all thin filaments again one more time are going to be the Z discs. Sarcomere is simply the distance between two successive Z discs, and it is going to be the contractile unit of my skeletal muscle cells. Looking at the relationship between the thick filaments and the thin filaments. So you see on here, there are portions of the thick filaments that are not covered with thin filaments. You see on here? We call this is my H zone. What is the H zone? It's the zone that the thick filaments are not going to be covered with thin filaments. So again. So what should I repeat, Lakeisha? All right, so again, what we're looking at here, we have alternating thick and thin filaments. Thick filaments are attached at the center by the M line. Thin filaments are attached to one another by the Z discs. The distance between two successive Z discs is going to be my sarcomere. It's the distance between two successive Z discs. The parts of the thick filaments that are not going to be covered with thin filaments, like what you see on here, this zone on here, this is what we call the H zone. This is my H zone on here. It has thick filaments, but not thin filaments. Any problem? Any problem with the structure of the sarcomere? Any questions? This is essential for you to understand what we're going to be talking about in 20 minutes from now. All right, great. So, how do you contract your muscle? So keep all this information in the back of your mind, the structure of the sarcomere. We're going to get back to it in a second. Remember, if you are contracting your biceps, it's a voluntary control. So you decide to contract your biceps, right? It's under voluntary control, it's under conscious control. So the part in your brain is going to be responsible to send out the signal to your skeletal muscle for it to contract. It's called the cerebral cortex, as we're going to learn in details in the next chapters. Inside the cerebral cortex, you've got nerve cells. Those are my neurons that will be traveling down, down, down from the brain to the spinal cord until I reach the level of the spinal cord that's going to be innervating my biceps brachii. So I will be traveling all the way down from the cerebral cortex in the brain until I reach the part of the spinal cord that I need to get the signal out through a nerve fiber. So I will be sending out this signal to another nerve cell that will carry the signal to my skeletal muscle. For my skeletal muscle to respond to the signal by contracting. So now I did send out the signal from the brain down to the spinal cord and then exits the spinal cord through a nerve to reach my skeletal muscle. And when I reach the skeletal muscle will be able to contract. So in this chapter, we're focusing here on how this takes place. How the signal, it's gonna be allowing the muscle to contract. This is the questions that we're gonna be answering in the remaining of today's class and in over the next class as well. So here I am magnifying the junction between the nerve cell, this is a nerve cell, and this is a muscle cell, skeletal muscle cell. Nerve cells will have terminal ends called the telodendria, and they have those enlarged parts. This is where you're going to be storing chemicals that are essential for you to send out the signal to whatever effector organ that you're trying to send the signal to. What kind of signals? What kind of signals are you sending out through your nervous system? Chemical signal, electrical signal. What do you think? Through the nervous system, what signals am I conducting? Electrical, exactly. So I'm conducting electrical signal, and we're going to discuss how are electrical signals conducted through your nerve cells and muscle cells. Just to simplify the electrical signal conduction. So do you know how your computer works? How the information is transmitted? So for example, I'm drawing on my tablet here. This signal is going to be transported to my computer and then transported to the platform, and then from the platform it gets distributed to your devices, to the router, and then from the router to your computer processor, and then from the processor to the RAM, and then from the RAM to the screen for you to be able to see what I'm drawing right now on the tablet. So all this takes place. How do I conduct those signals? What do you think? If you have a flash drive and you're transporting a file, you're getting a copy of a file on this flash drive to your computer device. what kind of signal is transported here? From the flash drive to your computer device is going to be a form of electrical signal, all right? Electrical signal. What are the two options if you are conducting electricity in a wire? If I'm conducting electricity, I have only two options. Either I have electricity or I don't have electricity. Those are the only two options. So all what we are seeing on your screen has been conducted in a form of code, exactly. And this code is going to be formed as a binary code. 1 0 1 0 0 0 1 1 1 1 0 0 0 0 0 1 1 1 1 1 0 0. And those codes going to be transported to your processor, and the processor is going to be decoding the signal into something that you can see, into something that you can hear, into something that you can write down on a tablet, on whatever. So you are conducting the signals in the form of zeros and ones. And each one of them here is, it's called a bit. And together, 7 of them is going to be a byte. And then 1,000 bytes is going to be a kilobyte. 1,000 kilobytes is going to be a megabyte. 1,000 megabytes is going to be a gigabyte. 1,000 is going to be a terabyte, and so on. So a bit is a single electrical signal, whether you do have it or not. So the same exact concept takes place in your nervous and muscular system. You are conducting an electrical signal in the form of 0 and 1. So what is the 0? 0 means I have no signal. 0 for my nervous system is having inside to be negatively charged compared to the outside, which is positively charged. Having inside of the cell being negatively charged and outside of the cell membrane is positively charged, this means for my nervous system, this means for my muscular system that I don't have a signal conducted, 0. How about I'm conducting a signal, an electrical signal now. Electrical signal is simply means inside, rather than being negatively charged, is going to become more positively charged. And outside is going to be more negatively charged. So having a signal conducted through my nerve cells along the cell membrane means for me that inside becomes more positive and outside becomes more negatively charged. This means I have a signal conducted through the nerve cell or the muscle cell. So again, where is the signal coming from? It's coming from my cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex will cause the signal to be conducted to another cell in the spinal cord that exits the spinal cord through a nerve. And this signal is transported to your muscle cell. We're looking here how the signal that you're transporting in the nerve cells, this is my nerve cell again, is gonna allow the muscle to contract. So I've got a signal towards the terminal end of my nerve cell. I've got a signal towards the terminal end of the nerve cell. Is this gonna cause the opening of a membrane channel that allows calcium to travel in the cell? So normally it's a channel which is gated, it's closed. Until when? Until you get an electrical signal. When you get an electrical signal, this calcium channel opens. So we call this channel is a voltage gated calcium channel. What this means again, this simply means that when you get an electrical impulse down to the terminal end of the nerve cell, this channel will open, allowing calcium to travel from outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. When you get the calcium in, this enhances vesicles that are storing special chemicals. We call the chemicals here that will be released from the nerve cells. Those are my neurotransmitters. Those vesicles containing the neurotransmitters gonna be mobilized and they will fuse with the cell membrane, releasing the neurotransmitters out of the nerve cell. So the chemicals that have been stored inside those vesicles are now released between the nerve cell and the muscle cell. So I will be drawing the muscle cell in orange on here. This is the cell membrane of the muscle cell, like this. Now I've got the chemicals, the neurotransmitter, released from the nerve cell into the junction between the nerve and the muscle cell. We call this is my neuromuscular junction or synapse. This is the space filled by fluid between the nerve cell and the muscle cell. Again, you've released what in here? You've released a type of neurotransmitters called acetylcholine. Again, what enhances the release of the acetylcholine from your nerve ends is going to be the opening of the voltage-gated calcium channels. And what did allow the voltage-gated calcium channels to open is the presence of an electrical signal. And where did you get this electrical signal from? It's coming down from my cerebral cortex. So again, what we're looking at here, we've got a signal created and transported through my central nervous system, created in the cerebral cortex, transported to my spinal cord, exits the spinal cord through the nerve, and the nerve here transports the electrical signal to my skeletal muscle. What's going to happen? At the neuromuscular junction between the nerve cell and the muscle cell, you get the electrical signal towards the terminal end of the nerve cells. This will cause the activation of the voltage-gated calcium channels. And those voltage-gated calcium channels will allow the calcium influx. Calcium is passing now to the inside of the cell. Calcium, as it passes inside of the cell, it mobilizes the vesicles storing the neurotransmitter. And again, remind me, please, what is the name of the neurotransmitters that we're looking at in here? It's my acetylcholine. Did I perform any contraction of the muscle so far? Do I have any shortening in the length of the muscle fiber? Did I shorten the length of the muscle fiber? Did I reduce the length of anything? Did I do anything? Not yet. Not yet. What I did so far, I did transport the signal from the brain to the cell membrane of the muscle cell. Can you remind me what was the name of the plasma membrane of the muscle cell? On the side in here, what do we call it? It's my sarcolemma. So this is a sarcolemma of which is a plasma membrane of the muscle cell. All right, so let me stop at this point today. Next class on Thursday, we're going to be completing our discussion of what happens next after you release a neurotransmitter, how is this going to affect the skeletal muscle cell. For now, we can have our activity here for today. All right, so please name the different parts of the sarcomere. So start here. This is one. Hold this together. Two. This is going to be three. Four. For 7 and 8, please mention name, protein subunit of 3, and for 8, name the protein subunit of 4. All right, so we've got 8 things to complete. 8 things to complete on here. Number 1 are those blue lines that are traveling on both sides of the diagram. We've got the distance between two successive blue lines. This is going to be number 2. The thick pink segments on here, this is going to be number 3. The thin ones, which are alternating with them, this is going to be number 4. Those pink lines that are connecting those thick segments are going to be number 6. And the part that is formed of only those pink segments without having any coverage of the blue lines, this is going to be number 5. For number 7, please name the protein subunit of number 3 that forms number 3. And for number 8, please name the most important and the most commonly found protein subunit that's going to be located forming number 4. Anything which is not clear so far? Any questions? Any questions? Again, lab exam is not, I didn't confirm yet the exact date and the process. So I will let you updated next class. Are you going to post this video on Facebook group page? Last class was posted yesterday. Last class was posted yesterday. It takes me around 5 to 6 hours to post the video. So by midday tomorrow, it should be posted on Facebook. Yes, this video will be posted on Facebook. Please double check the Facebook group. It should be posted. Our last meeting on Tuesday, it has been posted on Facebook. Just double check it and let me know. What's due this Tuesday? So my recommendation is to get the visible body muscles lab assignment done, to get the activity from last class done, to get the chapter 10 quiz done. All of them are going to be open until the end of the semester, but this is my recommendation for you to benefit the most of today's class. I highly recommend you to complete the muscles lab assignment, the in-class activity of last time, and the chapter 10 quiz. All right, get those completed for you to stay on track. All right, so we don't have something that is due on Tuesday 31st, March 31st. All right, all of those things are going to be due at the end of the semester for me to give you time as much as I can. All right, so nothing is due, but my recommendation is to get those stuff completed. Do not wait, because when we're going to have our lab exam, you won't have enough time to get them completed before the exam. All right, so again, the exam date is not confirmed yet, so I will update you as soon as I get this information. All right, any questions for me today? All right, great. Thank you so much for making it to the virtual meeting today, and we'll see you next week on Tuesday at 5 o'clock as we gonna be completing our meetings. Stay safe, stay home, and thank you again for making it to the virtual meeting. We'll see you on Tuesday. Thank you so much. Have a good evening all. Stay safe. Thank you.